The story of how we grow and change across the lifespan is one of the most interesting in all of psychology. We'll begin by considering how genetic and environmental factors interact to shape us before we're even born. Development begins at conception. Sperm and egg cell unite to form the fertilized egg or zygote. Within hours of this union, the nuclei of the two cells merge. The zygote begins a process of dividing and redividing, producing a blastocyst, a mass of identical cells. About 10 to 14 days after fertilization, the blastocyst attaches itself to the wall of the uterus. Then, the embryonic stage begins. During this phase, cells differentiate into three distinct types: those that will become the nervous system and outer skin, those that will form the skeletal system and voluntary muscles, and those that will form the gut and digestive organs. 1 month after conception, the embryo begins to develop the major organ systems of the body, including the heart and lungs. Also, the arms, legs, and facial features. At about the same time, we can detect the beginnings of a nervous system. 2 months after conception, the fetal stage begins. By this point, the mass of cells, now called a fetus, has grown to 1 inch in length, and the heart has begun to beat. The nervous system continues to grow at a remarkable pace. New nerve cells are generated at a rate that can approach 250,000 new cells per minute, and these cells start to form a network. The fetus is capable of simple behaviors. For instance, it'll show a sucking reflex if its lips are touched. It's not long before other, more sophisticated capacities come into view, including the capacity for learning. In one study, researchers asked pregnant mothers to read aloud to their unborn infants twice a day for the last 6 weeks of their pregnancy. Once the babies were born, researchers set up an apparatus that was controlled by the way newborns sucked on a special pacifier. If they sucked in one way, the apparatus played a story their mothers had read before they were born. If they sucked in another way, the apparatus played an unfamiliar story. The researchers found that the infants adjusted their sucking pattern so that they could listen to the story which they'd been exposed to in utero, indicating that the infants had learned one story and preferred it to the other story they didn't know. And that is very interesting. So what is guiding prenatal development? The genome, for sure, but it's also important to note that environmental factors are just as important. So what does environment really mean in this early stage of development? Consider the earliest stages of embryonic growth. Every cell in the embryo has the same genes and receives the same genetic instructions. So how does each cell manage to develop appropriately into different body parts? The answer seems to be that the fate of each cell is determined in part by its cellular neighbors, the cells that form its physical environment. As the cells reproduce and differentiate, they become distinct, and the newly created neurons actually migrate toward their appropriate positions. This migration process is guided by glial cells acting as guide wires. Various chemicals also guide the process by attracting some types of nerve cells and repelling other types. In all cases, the migrating neurons approach the surface of the developing cortex, but the first arriving neurons stop short of the surface. Later arriving neurons pass these now stationary cells, and these late arrivals in turn are passed by even later arrivals. As a result, the cortex develops from the inside out, with layers closer to the surface established later than the deeper layers. So far, we've focused on how the local environment surrounding each neuron guides its differentiation and migration. More global features of the environment also play a major role, namely the organism's own bodily fluids, especially its blood. So for example, hormones circulating in the fetus's blood have a powerful influence on the development of the child's external anatomy and the development of the nervous system. Also, the bloodstream of mammalian embryos is intimately connected to the mother's blood supply, and so her blood too becomes part of the embryo's environment. Unfortunately, many environmental factors are teratogens, factors that can disrupt development. Teratogens include general environmental factors, such as air pollution and radiation, lead and mercury, but also cigarettes, alcohol, and drugs that the mother may use, or viruses she may carry. Teratogens do not always harm the fetus, but they are more likely to do so when they occur in larger amounts, for longer periods of time, and when the fetus is growing most rapidly. The average newborn weighs approximately 7.5 pounds. Although small, a newborn is not completely helpless because their reflexes and sensory capacities help them interact with the environment. Newborn reflexes are inborn automatic responses to particular forms of stimulation. They are crucial to survival as they help the newborn survive until it's capable of more complex behaviors. They usually disappear around 4 to 5 months of age. Here are some examples of reflexes. The rooting reflex is the newborn's response to anything that touches her cheek. When you stroke a baby's cheek, she naturally turns her head in that direction and begins to suck. The sucking reflex is the automatic, unlearned sucking motions that infants do with their mouths. Also, if you put your finger into a newborn's hand, you will witness the grasping reflex. The baby will automatically grasp anything that touches their palms. The Moro reflex is the newborn's response when they feel like they're falling. The baby spreads their arms, pulls them back in, and usually cries. But even at birth, the infant's immature brain is ready to support many activities, as their senses function quite well from the start. Infants can discriminate between tones of a different pitch and loudness, and they show early preference for their mother's voice over that of a stranger. Though quite nearsighted, newborns can see objects a foot or so away, discriminate brightness and color, and track a moving stimulus with their eyes. Okay, well, I mean, hold on. Wait a minute. How can we possibly know these things about infants? They can't understand language to follow instructions. They can't talk to tell us that they understand the difference between stimuli. They can't even point. You might think that some serious high-tech methods must be used, but the opposite is actually the case. To study perceptual and cognitive abilities of infants, habituation procedures are used. Habituation is the decline in responding to a stimulus once the stimulus has become familiar. In a habituation experiment, a baby might be placed in a high chair and presented with visual stimuli while a video camera records their eye and face movements. When the experiment begins, a stimulus, for example the face of an adult, appears in the baby's field of view, and the amount of time the baby looks at the face is recorded by the camera. Then, the stimulus is removed for a few seconds before it appears again, and the gaze is again measured. Over time, the baby starts to habituate to the face, such that each presentation elicits less looking or gazing at the stimulus. Then, a new stimulus, for example the face of a different adult, or the same face looking in a different direction is presented, and the researchers observe whether the gaze time significantly increases. If the infant's gaze time increases when a new stimulus is presented, this indicates that the baby can differentiate between the two stimuli. The trick of this procedure is simply to change the stimulus in controlled ways to see if the baby notices the difference. Research using the habituation procedure has found that babies can notice changes in colors, sounds, and even principles of numbers and physics. Everyone is affected differently by their personal experiences, of course, but we all share inherent genetic growth tendencies. We roll over before we sit before we stand, and we stand before we walk. The same thing applies to our cognitive development, how we learn to think, know, remember, and communicate. And if we're going to talk about cognitive development, we gotta start with Jean Piaget, developmental psychologist extraordinaire. Piaget was known for testing children's aptitudes and abilities. He became fascinated by the fact that children of a certain age consistently made particular mistakes that older kids and adults didn't. And then, he theorized that these mistakes and later successes revealed the way that humans go through specific stages of cognitive development. In fact, Piaget's most important contribution to understanding cognitive development was the idea that development occurs in unique and distinct stages, with each stage occurring at a specific time, in a specific sequence, and in a way that allows the child to think about the world using new capacities. Piaget argued that children do not just passively learn, but also actively try to make sense of their worlds. As they learn and mature, children develop schemas, patterns of knowledge and long-term memory that help them remember, organize, and respond to information. When children experience new things, they attempt to reconcile the new knowledge with existing schemas. He believed that children use two distinct methods in doing so: assimilation and accommodation. When children employ assimilation, they use already developed schemas to understand new information. If children have learned a schema for horses, They may call the striped animal they see at the zoo a horse rather than a zebra. In this case, children label the new information with existing knowledge. Accommodation, on the other hand, involves learning new information and thus changing the schema. When a mother says, "No, honey, that's a zebra, not a horse," the child may adapt the schema to fit the new stimulus, learning that there are different types of four-legged animals. But our knowledge base grows in ways that are much more complex than just those two steps, and Piaget knew that. He went on to devise a 4-stage theory of cognitive development that describes how we learn in different phases of our lives. He called stage 1 the sensory motor stage, from birth on to about age 2. This is the time when babies experience the world through their senses and actions. Touching, grabbing, looking, hearing, putting things in their mouth. At this stage, Piaget observed that younger babies have to see something to know it exists. He realized that infants typically look at a new toy with delight, but if the toy disappears from view, they show little concern. At a slightly later age, infants might show signs of distress when the toy disappears, but they still make no effort to retrieve it. At about 8 months, infants do start to search for toys that have been hidden, but even then, their searching shows a peculiar limitation. Suppose that a 9-month-old sees an experimenter hide a toy monkey under a cover located to the child's right. The child will happily push the cover off and snatch up the monkey. The experimenter now repeats the process a few times, always hiding the monkey under the same cover to the child's right. Again and again, the child pulls the cover off and retrieves the monkey. But now, the experimenter slightly changes the procedure. Very slowly and in full view of the child, she hides the toy in a different place, say, under a cover to the child's left. The child closely watches her every movement, and then does exactly what he did before. He searches under the cover on the right, even though he saw the experimenter hide the toy another place just a moment earlier. This phenomenon is called the A not B effect, where A designates the place where the object was first hidden, and B is the place where it was hidden last. Why does this error occur? Piaget argued that the 9-month-old still has not grasped the fact that the object's existence is independent of his own actions. So the child believes that his reaching toward place A, where he found the toy previously, is as much a part of the monkey as the monkey's tail is. In effect, then, the child is not really searching for the monkey. He's searching for the monkey that I find on the right. According to Piaget, a major accomplishment of the sensory motor period is coming to understanding that objects exist on their own, even when they are not reached for, seen, heard, or felt. Piaget held that what makes this accomplishment possible is the infant's increasingly sophisticated schemas. In this way, object permanence is considered one of the major achievements of the sensory motor stage. The second of Piaget's phases of development is the pre-operational stage, and he believed it began around age 2 and carried on through age 6 or 7. The pre-operational stage is marked by a child's ability to mentally represent objects and events with words and images, and they're big into animism now, and they believe that their favorite teddy bear, Batman, or stuffed zebra, not horse, has feelings and opinions. During this stage, children begin to use language and to think more abstractly about objects, but their understanding is more intuitive and without much ability to deduce or reason. The thinking is pre-operational, meaning that the child lacks the ability to operate on or transform objects mentally. In one study that showed the extent of this inability, researchers showed children a room within a small dollhouse. Inside the room, a small toy was visible behind a small couch. The researchers took the children to another lab room, which was an exact replica of the dollhouse room but full-sized.
Okay, Charlotte, can you come find Big Snoopy? Remember, Big Snoopy's hiding in the same place in his room where Little Snoopy's hiding.
When children who were about 2.5 years old were asked to find the toy, they didn't know where to look. They were simply unable to make the transition across the change in room size.
Remember, Big Snoopy's in the same place where Little Snoopy's hiding. He's in the same place Little Snoopy is. You know, I think he's back there somewhere. Let's just see if you can find him back there.
3-year-old children, on the other hand, immediately look for the toy behind the couch. They were improving their operational skills.
Now you watch while I hide Little Snoopy. And I'm hiding him right there, okay? He's hiding there. Now I'm going to take Big Snoopy, and I'm going to take Big Snoopy and hide him in the same place in his big room, okay? Okay, Mario, Big Snoopy's hiding. Remember, he's hiding in the same place in his big room where Little Snoopy is. Can you find him? Come find Big Snoopy. Let's see where he is.
The inability of young children to view transitions also leads them to be egocentric. The ability to take another person's viewpoint increases rapidly during the preoperational stage. Another revealing example of preoperational thought is the young child's apparent failure to conserve. One procedure demonstrating this failure uses two identical glasses, which stand side by side and are filled with the same amount of liquid.
Okay, tell me when this one is the same.
The same.
The same? Those two are the same now?
Yeah.
We're going to take the blue water from this glass, and we're going to pour it into this glass. Now, does this glass have more water? Does this glass have more water, or are they the same?
Has more water.
This one has more water?
Yeah.
Can you tell me why?
Because that one's higher than that.
In the preoperational period, children also fail tests that depend on the conservation of number.
Does this row have more quarters? Does this row have more quarters, or are they the same?
The same.
The same? Okay, now watch. Now, does this row have more quarters? Does this row have more quarters, or are they the same?
That one has more quarters.
That one has more quarters?
Yeah.
Why does that one have more quarters?
Because it's stretched out.
Why do preschool children fail to conserve? According to Piaget, part of the problem is their inability to interrelate different dimensions of a situation. To conserve liquid quantity, for example, the children must first comprehend that there are two relevant factors, the height and width of the glass. They must then appreciate that a decrease in the column's height is accompanied by an increase in its width. So the children must be able to attend to both dimensions simultaneously and relate the dimensions to each other. Piaget's third stage of cognitive development is the concrete operational stage, around ages 6 to 12. In this stage, kids are starting to think logically about concrete events that they've experienced. Children now grasp the fact that changes in one aspect of a situation can be compensated by changes in some other aspect. They're also able to transform their own mental representations in a variety of ways and understand, for example, what would happen if the liquid were poured back into its original glass. But according to Piaget, children's intellectual capacities are still limited in an important way. They can apply their mental operations only to concrete objects or events. It's not until age 11 or 12 that formal operations begin. This is a stage marked by the ability to think in abstract terms and to use scientific and philosophical lines of thought. Children in the formal operational stage are better able to systematically test alternative ideas to determine their influences on outcomes. For instance, rather than haphazardly changing different aspects of a situation that allow no clear conclusions to be drawn, they systematically make changes in one thing at a time and observe what difference that particular change makes. They learn to use deductive reasoning and become capable of imagining situations that might be. Despite the tremendous impact of Piaget's four-stage model on our thinking about development, it has also been criticized for oversimplifying things and for being too rigid in how it classifies certain abilities by age. Today, for example, researchers have detected these phases at earlier ages than Piaget ever did. Like some types of object permanence have been observed in babies as young as 3 months. In spite of many updates to Piaget's theory, there's no doubt he's one of the most influential developmental psychologists in history, and that his work remains relevant to this day. But cognitive skills are only part of the changes that are occurring during childhood. Equally crucial is the development of the child's social skills, the ability to understand, predict, and create bonds with the other people in their environments. One of the important milestones in a child's social development is learning about his or her own self-existence. This self-awareness is known as consciousness, and the content of consciousness is known as the self-concept. The self-concept is a representation or schema that contains knowledge about us, including our beliefs about our personality traits, physical characteristics, abilities, values, goals, and roles, as well as the knowledge that we exist as individuals. Some animals have at least a primitive sense of self, including chimpanzees, orangutans, and perhaps dolphins. In one study, researchers painted a dot on the foreheads of anesthetized chimpanzees, and then placed each animal in a cage with a mirror. When the chimps woke up and looked in the mirror, they touched the dots on their faces and not the dots on the faces in the mirror. These actions suggest that the chimps understood that they were looking at themselves and not other animals. Infants who have a similar dot painted on their foreheads recognize themselves in a mirror in the same way by about 18 months of age. By age 2, the infant becomes aware of his or her gender. By age 4, self-descriptions are likely to be based on physical features like hair color and possessions. And by about age 6, the child is able to understand basic emotions and concepts of traits, being able to make statements like, "I'm a nice person." Soon after, by about age 5 or 6, they begin to make comparisons with other children, a process known as social comparison. For example, a child might describe himself as being faster than one boy but slower than another. Psychological development also occurs as children form relationships, interact with others, and manage their feelings. Forming healthy attachments is very important and is a major social milestone of infancy. The emotional bonds that we develop with those whom we feel closest, and particularly the bonds the infant develops with the mother or primary caregiver, are referred to as attachment. Studies by the developmental psychologist John Bowlby and others in the 1950s show that children in orphanages did not develop normally. They were usually sickly, emotionally slow to respond, and generally unmotivated. These observations helped make it clear that normal infant development requires successful attachment to a caregiver.
Let me show you a monkey raised on a nursing wire mother.
In one classic study showing the importance of attachment, Wisconsin University psychologists Harry and Margaret Harlow investigated the responses of young monkeys separated from their biological mothers to two surrogate fake mothers introduced to their cages. One mother, the wire mother, consisted of a round wooden head and a mesh of cold metal wires, with a bottle of milk from which the babies could drink. The second mother was a foam rubber form wrapped in a heated terry cloth blanket, with no milk.
He's going to the wire mother.
The Harlows found that although the infant monkeys went to the wire mother for food, they overwhelmingly preferred and spent significantly more time with the warm terry cloth mother that provided no food but did provide comfort.
This is the apparatus we use.
That looks diabolical.
That's just the way the baby monkey feels about it.
He's scared, all right.
And he does what any child will do in a similar situation. Contact with the mother changes his entire personality. Look, now he's actually threatening the diabolical object.
The Harlow studies confirm that babies have social as well as physical needs. Both monkeys and human babies need a secure base that allows them to feel safe. From this base, they can gain the confidence they need to venture out and explore their worlds. Developmental psychologist Mary Ainsworth measured an infant's attachment to his or her parent. The test is called the strange situation. During the procedure, the parent and the infant are first left alone, while the infant explores the room full of toys. Then, a strange adult enters the room and talks for a minute to the parent, after which the parent leaves the room. The stranger stays with the infant for a few minutes, and then the parent again enters and the stranger leaves. A child with a secure attachment style usually explores freely while the mother is present and engages with the stranger. The child may be upset when the mother departs, but is also happy to see the mother return. A child with an ambivalent attachment style is wary about the situation in general, particularly the stranger, and stays close or even clings to the mother rather than exploring the toys. When the mother leaves, the child is extremely distressed and is ambivalent when she returns. A child with an avoidant attachment style will avoid or ignore the mother, showing little emotion when the mother departs or returns. The child may run away from the mother when she approaches. The child will not explore very much, regardless of who is there, and the stranger will not be treated much differently from the mother. Finally, a child with a disorganized attachment style seems to have no consistent way of coping with the stress of the strange situation. The child may cry during the separation, but avoid the mother when she returns. Or, the child may approach the mother but freeze or fall to the floor. Although some cultural differences in attachment styles have been found, research has also found that the proportion of children who fall into each of the attachment categories is relatively constant across cultures. You might wonder whether differences in attachment style are determined more by the child's nature or more by the parent's nurture. Most developmental psychologists believe that socialization, nurture, is primary, arguing that a child becomes securely attached when the parent is available and able to meet the needs of the child. Insecure styles occur when the parent is insensitive and responds inconsistently to the child's needs. It's important to note, though, that the attachment behavior of a child is also likely influenced, at least in part, by temperament, the innate personality traits of the infant. Some children are warm, friendly, and responsive, whereas others tend to be more irritable, less manageable, and difficult to console. These differences may also play a role in attachment. Taken together, it seems safe to say that attachment, like all other developmental processes, is affected by an interplay of genetic and environmental influences. A number of studies have demonstrated that these working models of attachment do seem to have important consequences. For example, children who are securely attached as infants are more likely as teenagers to have close friends and are less likely to suffer from anxiety disorders in childhood and adolescence. Another major developmental task, beginning in childhood and continuing into adolescence, is understanding right from wrong. Psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg believed that moral development, like cognitive development, follows a series of stages. To develop his theory, Kohlberg posed moral dilemmas to people of all ages and analyzed their answers to find evidence of their particular stage of moral development. Here's Kohlberg's best-known moral dilemma, commonly known as the Heinz dilemma. A woman in Europe was near death from a rare kind of cancer. There was one drug that the doctors thought might save her, but the druggist was charging 10 times what the drug cost him to make. He charged $2,000 for a small dose of the drug. The sick woman's husband, Heinz, went to everyone he knew to borrow money, but he could only get together about $1,000. He told the druggist that his wife was dying and asked him to sell it cheaper or let him pay later, but the druggist said no. Heinz got desperate and broke into the man's store to steal the drug for his wife. Should the husband have done that? After presenting people with this and various other moral dilemmas, Kohlberg reviewed people's responses and placed them in different stages of moral reasoning. According to Kohlberg, an individual progresses from the capacity for pre-conventional morality, before age 9, to the capacity for conventional morality, during early adolescence, and toward attaining post-conventional morality, which only a few fully achieve. Kohlberg placed in the highest stage responses that reflected the reasoning that Heinz should steal the drug because his wife's life is more important than the pharmacist making money. The value of a human life overrides the pharmacist's greed. Many psychologists agree with Kohlberg's theory of moral development, but point out that moral reasoning is very different from moral behavior. Sometimes what we say we would do in a situation is not what we would actually do in that situation. But anyway, how does this theory apply to males and females? Kohlberg felt that more males than females achieve the highest stage of moral development. Oopsie daisy. He went on to note that women seem to be deficient in their moral reasoning abilities, and now there's a recording of me saying that. These ideas were not well received by Carol Gilligan, a research assistant of Kohlberg, who consequently developed her own ideas of moral development in her groundbreaking book, A Different Voice: Psychological Theory and Women's Development. Gilligan criticized her former mentor's theory because it was based only on upper-class white males. She argued that women are not deficient in moral reasoning. She proposed that males and females simply reason differently. Girls and women focus more on staying connected and the importance of interpersonal relationships. Therefore, in the Heinz dilemma, many girls and women respond that Heinz should not steal the medicine. The reasoning is that if he steals the medicine, he is arrested and is put in jail, and then he and his wife will be separated, and she could die while he is in prison. This work highlights the importance of considering individual differences when examining any aspect of development. Development proceeds through the interaction among physical, cognitive, and socio-emotional factors. Just as influences of nature and nurture are evident only through their interaction, so physical, cognitive, and socio-emotional development are interwoven to constitute the whole person.